The fluorescent lights hummed their usual monotonous tune as I gathered my things from my desk, another Wednesday evening blending into the blur of corporate routine. Thompson and Associates had a way of making every day feel identical. Same beige walls, same recycled air, same faces moving through the same motions. I'd been working there for 3 years as a junior marketing analyst. And at 34, I was starting to wonder if this was all there was to professional life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is David Chen, and I suppose I'm what you'd call a quiet achiever. I keep my head down, meet my deadlines, and avoid office drama like it's a contagious disease. Growing up in Seattle, I learned early that blending in was safer than standing out. My parents, both immigrants who worked multiple jobs to give me opportunities, always emphasized the importance of steady employment and not rocking the boat. So here I was, boat unrocked, steady as a rock, and slowly dying inside. The office was nearly empty by 6:30, which wasn't unusual. Most people fled the moment the clock struck 5, eager to return to their real lives. I was usually one of them. But tonight I'd volunteered to stay late to finish a presentation for tomorrow's client meeting. The project involved analyzing consumer behavior patterns for a local restaurant chain, and while it wasn't exactly groundbreaking work, it paid the bills and kept me employed. As I walked past the cubicles toward the elevator, I noticed a light, still on in the corner office. Margaret Rodriguez, our senior project manager, was hunched over her computer, her usually perfect posture replaced by the slouched shoulders of someone who'd been sitting too long. Her dark hair, normally styled in that professional bob that screamed, "I mean business," was slightly disheveled, and she'd removed her suit jacket, revealing a simple white blouse that somehow made her look more human than I'd ever seen her. Margaret was one of those people who commanded respect without demanding it. At 51, she'd climbed the corporate ladder with a combination of intelligence, determination, and what seemed like an impenetrable professional facade. She rarely spoke about her personal life, never participated in office gossip, and maintained a polite but distant relationship with everyone, including me. In 3 years, our interactions had been limited to project briefings, status updates, and the occasional nod in the hallway. But something about seeing her there, alone in the empty office, made me pause. Maybe it was the way the harsh fluorescent light cast shadows under her eyes, or the fact that she'd kicked off her heels and was sitting with her feet tucked under her chair like a college student cramming for finals. Whatever it was, I found myself knocking on her open door. "Margaret, you okay?" She looked up, blinking as if she'd forgotten other people existed. For a moment, her guard was completely down, and I saw something in her eyes that I'd never seen before. Exhaustion, not just physical but emotional. Then, just as quickly, the professional mask slipped back into place. "Oh, David. Yes, I'm fine. Just finishing up some reports." Her voice had that measured tone she used in meetings, but there was a crack in it, barely perceptible. I stepped into her office, noting the family photos on her desk that I'd never really looked at before. There was a picture of her with a teenage boy who had her same dark eyes and serious expression, another of her with an older woman who shared her smile, and a third of her in hiking gear on what looked like a mountain trail, her face genuinely happy in a way I'd never seen at work. "Long day?" I asked, settling into the chair across from her desk. She laughed, but it wasn't the polite laugh she used in meetings. This one was raw, tired, real. "Long year, more like it. Long decade, if I'm being honest." There was something in her tone that made me stay instead of making polite conversation and leaving. I'd never seen Margaret Rodriguez be anything less than completely composed, completely in control. But sitting there in her stocking feet, with her hair messed up and her shoulders sagging, she looked like a person instead of a position. "Want to talk about it?" The words came out before I could stop them. I wasn't the kind of person who invited personal conversations with senior management. I was the kind of person who nodded politely and minded his own business. Margaret studied me for a long moment, as if she was seeing me for the first time. "You know what, David? I'm 51 years old, and I'm tired of pretending I don't have feelings." The statement hung in the air between us like a confession. I'd expected her to deflect, to give me the standard corporate response about everything being fine, and her just needing to wrap up some work. Instead, she'd said something so honest, so vulnerable, that I didn't know how to respond. I spend 8 hours a day, sometimes more, pretending to be this version of myself that doesn't exist, she continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. Professional Margaret, who never gets frustrated with impossible deadlines or incompetent clients. Professional Margaret, who doesn't care that her son barely calls anymore because she missed too many of his games and school events climbing this ladder. Professional Margaret, who doesn't feel anything when her coworkers talk about their weekend plans because she's too busy working to have any. The fluorescent lights hummed their usual monotonous tune as I gathered my things from my desk. Another Wednesday evening blending into the blur of corporate routine. Thompson and Associates had a way of making every day feel identical. Same beige walls, same recycled air, same faces moving through the same motions. I'd been working there for 3 years as a junior marketing analyst, and at 34, I was starting to wonder if this was all there was to professional life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is David Chen, and I suppose I'm what you'd call a quiet achiever. I keep my head down, meet my deadlines, and avoid office drama like it's a contagious disease. Growing up in Seattle, I learned early that blending in was safer than standing out. My parents, both immigrants who worked multiple jobs to give me opportunities, always emphasized the importance of steady employment and not rocking the boat. So here I was, boat unrocked, steady as a rock, and slowly dying inside. The office was nearly empty by 6:30, which wasn't unusual. Most people fled the moment the clock struck 5, eager to return to their real lives. I was usually one of them, but tonight I'd volunteered to stay late to finish a presentation for tomorrow's client meeting. The project involved analyzing consumer behavior patterns for a local restaurant chain, and while it wasn't exactly groundbreaking work, it paid the bills and kept me employed. As I walked past the cubicles toward the elevator, I noticed a light, still on in the corner office. Margaret Rodriguez, our senior project manager, was hunched over her computer, her usually perfect posture replaced by the slouched shoulders of someone who'd been sitting too long. Her dark hair, normally styled in that professional bob that screamed, "I mean business," was slightly disheveled, and she'd removed her suit jacket, revealing a simple white blouse that somehow made her look more human than I'd ever seen her. Margaret was one of those people who commanded respect without demanding it. At 51, she'd climbed the corporate ladder with a combination of intelligence, determination, and what seemed like an impenetrable professional facade. She rarely spoke about her personal life, never participated in office gossip, and maintained a polite but distant relationship with everyone, including me. In 3 years, our interactions had been limited to project briefings, status updates, and the occasional nod in the hallway. But something about seeing her there, alone in the empty office, made me pause. Maybe it was the way the harsh fluorescent light cast shadows under her eyes, or the fact that she'd kicked off her heels and was sitting with her feet tucked under her chair like a college student cramming for finals. Whatever it was, I found myself knocking on her open door. "Margaret, you okay?" She looked up, blinking as if she'd forgotten other people existed. For a moment her guard was completely down, and I saw something in her eyes that I'd never seen before. Exhaustion, not just physical but emotional. Then, just as quickly, the professional mask slipped back into place. "Oh, David. Yes, I'm fine. Just finishing up some reports." Her voice had that measured tone she used in meetings, but there was a crack in it, barely perceptible. I stepped into her office, noting the family photos on her desk that I'd never really looked at before. There was a picture of her with a teenage boy who had her same dark eyes and serious expression, another of her with an older woman who shared her smile, and a third of her in hiking gear on what looked like a mountain trail, her face genuinely happy in a way I'd never seen at work. "Long day?" I asked, settling into the chair across from her desk. She laughed, but it wasn't the polite laugh she used in meetings. This one was raw, tired, real. "Long year, more like it. Long decade, if I'm being honest." There was something in her tone that made me stay instead of making polite conversation and leaving. I'd never seen Margaret Rodriguez be anything less than completely composed, completely in control. But sitting there in her stocking feet with her hair messed up and her shoulders sagging, she looked like a person instead of a position. Want to talk about it? The words came out before I could stop them. I wasn't the kind of person who invited personal conversations with senior management. I was the kind of person who nodded politely and minded his own business. Margaret studied me for a long moment, as if she was seeing me for the first time. You know what, David? I'm 51 years old, and I'm tired of pretending I don't have feelings. The statement hung in the air between us like a confession. I'd expected her to deflect, to give me the standard corporate response about everything being fine and her just needing to wrap up some work. Instead, she'd said something so honest, so vulnerable, that I didn't know how to respond. I spend 8 hours a day, sometimes more, pretending to be this version of myself that doesn't exist, she continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. Professional Margaret, who never gets frustrated with impossible deadlines or incompetent clients. Professional Margaret, who doesn't care that her son barely calls anymore because she missed too many of his games and school events climbing this ladder. Professional Margaret, who doesn't feel anything when her coworkers talk about their weekend plans because she's too busy working to have any. I thought about what she was saying, about the culture of our office. She wasn't wrong. Thompson and Associates was the kind of place where people kept their heads down, did their work, and left. There was no sense of community, no real connection between colleagues. We were all just individuals performing our roles, going through the motions. Maybe it doesn't have to be that way, I said. Margaret looked at me with something like hope in her eyes. You think so? I think if more people were willing to be honest about how they feel, about what they want, about who they really are, everything would be different. Not just here, but everywhere. She was quiet for a moment, considering this. It's scary, though. Being real, being vulnerable. What if people don't like who you actually are? It was a question I'd asked myself countless times. I'd spent so much energy trying to be likable, trying to fit in, trying to be the person I thought others wanted me to be. But what if that person wasn't really me at all? Maybe the people who don't like who you actually are aren't your people, I said. Margaret laughed, and this time it was full of genuine amusement. When did you become so wise, David Chen? I don't know if it's wisdom or just desperation, I admitted. I'm tired too. Tired of pretending that this is enough, that going through the motions is the same as living. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both of us processing what we'd shared. The office felt different now, charged with possibility. Margaret Rodriguez, the untouchable senior manager, had revealed herself to be human. And in doing so, she'd given me permission to be human too. So what happens now? I asked. Margaret stood up, slipping her feet back into her heels but leaving her jacket draped over her chair. Now we figure out how to be real people in a world that's designed to keep us fake. She walked around her desk and extended her hand. To me, not in the formal handshake way of business meetings, but in the way of two people making an agreement. Partners in authenticity? She asked. I took her hand, feeling the warmth and strength in her grip. Partners in authenticity. As we walked toward the elevator together, I realized that this wasn't just the end of a long workday. It was the beginning of something entirely different. Something that would change not just how I saw Margaret Rodriguez, but how I saw myself, my work, and what it meant to be real in a world full of pretense. The elevator doors closed behind us, but for the first time in 3 years, I wasn't thinking about tomorrow's deadlines or next week's meetings. I was thinking about pottery classes and photography equipment, and the possibility that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to figure out who I really was underneath all the professional pretending. Margaret looked at me as the elevator descended, and there was something new in her expression. Not the distant professionalism I'd grown accustomed to, but something warmer, more genuine. You know what, David? I think this is going to be interesting. I couldn't have agreed more. The next morning arrived with the usual Seattle drizzle, but everything felt different as I walked into Thompson and Associates. The beige walls and fluorescent lights were the same, but I found myself noticing things I'd previously ignored. The way people avoided eye contact in the hallway, the forced smiles during elevator rides, the way conversations died when managers walked by. It was like Margaret's honesty the night before had given me a new lens through which to see our workplace. I arrived at my desk to find a small potted succulent sitting next to my computer monitor. There was no note, but I knew who had left it. The plant was simple, unpretentious, and somehow hopeful. Exactly the kind of gesture that the Margaret Rodriguez I'd known for 3 years would never have made. But this new Margaret, the one who took pottery classes and admitted to having feelings, was apparently full of surprises. At 9:15, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Coffee? Real coffee, not the break room sludge. And I looked toward her office and saw her standing by her window, phone in hand, looking directly at me. When our eyes met, she smiled. Not the polite professional smile I was used to, but something warmer and more genuine. I texted back, absolutely. We met at Harbor Grounds, a small cafe 3 blocks from the office that I'd walked past hundreds of times but never entered. Margaret was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth with 2 steaming mugs in front of her. She'd traded her usual power suit for dark jeans and a soft gray sweater that made her look younger, more approachable. I wasn't sure you'd come, she said as I slid into the seat across from her. I wasn't sure you'd meant it, I admitted, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. Last night felt like, I don't know, like it might have been a dream. Margaret laughed, and I was struck again by how different her real laugh was from her professional one. I keep thinking the same thing. I woke up this morning wondering if I'd actually told my coworker that I was tired of pretending I don't have feelings, or if I'd just imagined the whole conversation. You did. And you talked about pottery class and getting clay under your fingernails? Right. She shook her head, as if she still couldn't quite believe it. I don't typically share personal things with people at work. What changed? Margaret was quiet for a moment, staring into her coffee. Have you ever felt like you're living someone else's life? Like you wake up one day and realize you don't recognize the person you've become? I thought about my own morning routine. The way I'd gotten dressed in the same type of clothes I'd worn every day for 3 years. The way I'd checked my phone for work emails before I'd even fully woken up. Every day, I said. I had this realization recently, Margaret continued. My son Jake, he's 17 now. He was home for winter break, and we were sitting at dinner, and he asked me what I like to do for fun. Just a simple question, and I couldn't answer him. I literally sat there for 5 minutes trying to think of something I enjoyed doing that wasn't related to work or taking care of other people. She took a sip of her coffee, her expression distant. He looked at me with this mixture of confusion and pity, and he said, Mom, when's the last time you did something just because it made you happy? And I realized I couldn't remember. Not just recent memory. I genuinely could not remember the last time I'd done something purely for joy. I felt a familiar ache in my chest, the recognition of my own life reflected in her words. What did you tell him? I told him I'd think about it, and I did think about it. For weeks. I started paying attention to how I spent my time, what I talked about, what I thought about. And I realized that somewhere along the way, I'd stopped being a person and started being a function. Margaret the project manager, Margaret the divorced mother, Margaret the reliable employee. But where was just Margaret? The cafe was filling up with the morning rush, but our corner felt insulated from the noise and movement around us. Margaret was leaning forward now, her elbows on the table, speaking with an intensity that made me understand why she'd become a successful manager. When she focused on something, she gave it everything she had. I started doing research, she said. Not work research, personal research. I Googled things like, how to find yourself at 50, and is it too late to change your life? I felt ridiculous, like a teenager having an identity crisis. But I found all these articles about people who'd had similar realizations, who'd discovered they'd been living according to other people's expectations instead of their own values. What kind of expectations? Margaret's expression grew thoughtful. Professional expectations, mostly. The idea that successful people don't have emotional needs, that leadership means never showing vulnerability, that personal fulfillment is secondary to career advancement. I'd internalized all of these rules about how to be a professional woman, especially a professional woman over 40. Don't be too emotional, don't be too personal, don't let them see you struggle. She gestured around the cafe, at the mix of people talking, laughing, arguing, being human. But look at this place. Look at these people. They're not performing professionalism. They're just being themselves. And they seem so much more alive than anyone in our office. I followed her gaze, watching a group of college students animatedly discussing what seemed to be a class project, their faces bright with engagement. At another table, two older men were having what appeared to be a heated but friendly debate about something they clearly cared about. Near the window, a woman was working on a laptop, but she was smiling at whatever she was writing, her whole body language suggesting she was doing something she loved. When did we decide that being professional meant being fake? I asked. I don't know, Margaret said. But I know when I decided to stop. It was last night, sitting in that office, looking at my life, and realizing that I'd become really good at being someone I didn't even like. And then you knocked on my door, and you asked if I was okay. And for some reason, I decided to tell you the truth, instead of the lie I'd been telling everyone, including myself. She reached across the table and touched my hand briefly. Thank you for that, by the way, for asking, for listening, for not making me feel crazy for having feelings. Thank you for being honest, I said. It made me realize how dishonest I've been, with everyone, but mostly with myself. Margaret sat back, studying me with those sharp eyes that had intimidated me in meetings, but now felt curious and kind. Tell me about the dishonesty. What have you been pretending? The question caught me off guard. I'd spent so much time thinking about what I thought people wanted to hear that I wasn't sure I remembered what I actually thought or felt about anything. I guess I've been pretending that I'm satisfied with my life, that showing up, doing my job competently, and not causing problems is enough, that having a steady paycheck and a decent apartment and a routine is the same as having a life. But it's not enough? No. The word came out more forcefully than I'd intended. I feel like I'm sleepwalking, like I'm watching my life happen instead of living it. I have all these interests and dreams and ideas, but I never act on any of them because they don't fit into the neat little box of who I think I'm supposed to be. Margaret nodded. The box is comfortable, isn't it? Safe. Predictable. But it's also suffocating, I finished. Exactly. She smiled, but it was a sad smile. I've been in my box for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe freely. And then I took that pottery class, and I felt like myself for the first time in years. Not successful Margaret or professional Margaret or divorced Margaret. Just Margaret, trying something new and being terrible at it and loving every minute. What else have you been trying? Her face lit up. Well, I signed up for Italian lessons. I've always wanted to learn Italian. I went to Rome once about 15 years ago for a work conference, and I fell in love with the city. But I never had time to actually explore it because I was so focused on the business meetings. I promised myself I'd go back someday when I could really experience it. But someday it never came. She pulled out her phone and showed me a language learning app. I'm on day 12 of my streak. I can now say my name is Margaret and I like coffee in Italian. It's not much, but it's something I'm doing purely because I want to, not because I have to. That's amazing, I said, and I meant it. There was something infectious about her enthusiasm, the way her whole face changed when she talked about these small acts of rebellion against her former self. What about you? She asked. What's in your box that you've been afraid to let out? I thought about the photography equipment in my closet, the travel magazines I'd collected, the creative writing class I'd considered taking but never enrolled in. Photography, I said. I love taking pictures, but I've never done anything with it. I have this camera I bought 2 years ago, and I've probably used it 10 times. I keep telling myself I'll get serious about it someday, but I never do. Why not? Because I'm not very good at it? Because it feels selfish to spend time on something that's not productive? Because I'm afraid I'll discover I'm not as creative as I think I am? I laughed, but it came out bitter. Take your pick. Margaret leaned forward again. Can I tell you something that pottery class taught me? Being bad at something you love is infinitely better than being good at something you don't care about. I may never make a bowl that doesn't leak, but I've never felt more alive than when I was covered in clay, laughing at my own mistakes. You really think it's not too late? To start over, to try new things, to be different than we've been? David, I'm 51 years old. If I can learn to say I like coffee in Italian and make lopsided pottery, you can certainly take some pictures. The question isn't whether it's too late. The question is whether we're brave enough to try. Her words hit me like a challenge. I'd spent so much time focusing on what I couldn't do, what I wasn't good at, what I was afraid of, that I'd forgotten what I actually wanted to do. Sitting there with Margaret, seeing her transformation from untouchable professional to vulnerable human being, I realized that my own transformation was possible too. I have a confession, I said. I brought my camera to work yesterday. I saw this amazing light coming through the office windows around 5 o'clock, and I thought about how I'd want to capture it, but I didn't take the picture because I was afraid someone would see me and think I was being unprofessional. Margaret's eyes widened. You brought your camera to work? It's in my car. I've been carrying it around for weeks, but I never actually use it. David Chen, she said, her voice taking on a tone of mock seriousness. I think you're more ready for this transformation than you realize. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both of us processing what we'd shared. The cafe had quieted as the morning rush moved on, leaving us with a sense of peace and possibility. I have an idea, Margaret said suddenly. What if we made a pact? Not a work pact or a professional development plan, but a real life pact. What if we committed to doing one thing each week that's purely for ourselves? Something that makes us feel alive. Something that connects us to who we really are. Underneath all the professional pretending, I felt a surge of excitement at the idea. Like what? Like you taking pictures. Like me continuing with pottery and Italian lessons. Like both of us figuring out what it means to be authentic in a world that rewards fakeness. An authenticity pact, I said. Exactly. And maybe, she paused, looking almost shy. Maybe we could check in with each other. Not as manager and employee, but as people supporting each other's journey toward being real. I extended my hand across the table. Partners in authenticity? She shook it firmly. Partners in authenticity. As we walked back to the office, I felt like I was seeing the world through new eyes. The gray Seattle morning seemed brighter, the busy streets more alive with possibility, and when I caught my reflection in a storefront window, I saw something I hadn't seen in years. A person who was excited about what came next. Margaret caught me looking and smiled. You look different, she said. So do you, I replied. You look like someone who's about to turn everything upside down. Good, she said, because that's exactly what I intend to do. The changes started small, almost imperceptible at first. Margaret began leaving her office door open more often, and I noticed her having actual conversations with people instead of just exchanging the usual pleasantries about deadlines and deliverables. She'd replaced the generic motivational posters on her walls with a small framed photo from her pottery class, her hands covered in clay, grinning widely at the camera. It was such a departure from her previous office aesthetic that people began stopping by just to comment on it. I'd started bringing my camera to work regularly, keeping it in my desk drawer like a secret weapon against monotony. During lunch, breaks, I'd slip out to capture the way afternoon light filtered through the downtown buildings, or the interesting shadows cast by the construction cranes that dotted Seattle's skyline. The pictures weren't award-winning, but they were mine, and that felt revolutionary. Our authenticity pact was working, but what neither of us had anticipated was how our individual transformations would begin affecting the people around us. Thompson and Associates had always operated on an unspoken rule of professional distance. You did your job, minded your own business, and left your personality at home. But when two people suddenly start being genuinely themselves in an environment built on careful pretense, it creates ripples. The first person to notice was Elena Vasquez, our graphic designer. Elena was 28, fresh out of art school, and possessed the kind of creative energy that seemed constantly at odds with corporate culture. She'd been at Thompson & Associates for about 18 months, and I'd watched her gradually dim, her natural enthusiasm to fit into our beige-walled world. Her initial designs had been bold and innovative, but over time, they'd become safer, more conventional, more in line with what clients expected rather than what they needed. On a Thursday morning, about 2 weeks after Margaret and I had made our pact, Elena knocked on my cubicle wall. She was holding a coffee cup that looked like it had been hand-painted, all swirling blues and greens that reminded me of ocean waves. Is that from Margaret's pottery class? I asked, recognizing the Distinctive imperfect charm of beginner ceramics. Elena grinned. She gave it to me yesterday. Said she'd made too many and wondered if I'd like one. Can you believe she made this? It's amazing. I looked at the mug more closely. It was indeed imperfect, slightly lopsided with fingerprint impressions still visible in the clay. But it had character in a way that mass-produced items never could. It's really beautiful, I said. That's what I told her. And then we started talking about creative processes, and she mentioned that you've been taking photographs around the city. Elena's eyes lit up with the kind of excitement I hadn't seen from her in months. David, I had no idea you were into photography. I've been dying to find someone to do a photo walk with. The idea of sharing my amateur photography with someone felt terrifying and thrilling simultaneously. I'm not very good, I said automatically. So? I'm not very good at a lot of things I love doing. That's never stopped me before. Elena sat on the edge of my desk, her energy infectious. There's this amazing mural district in Georgetown that I've been wanting to explore. The street art scene there is incredible, and I think it would photograph beautifully. Want to check it out this weekend? I thought about my usual Saturday routine, grocery shopping, laundry, maybe a Netflix marathon, and realized how desperately I wanted to break free from it. Yes, I said. Absolutely yes. Perfect. I'll text you the details. Elena paused, looking around the office with new eyes. You know, it's weird. I feel like people are actually starting to be people around here instead of just job titles. She wasn't wrong. Over the next few days, I began noticing small but significant changes throughout the office. People were having conversations that went beyond work topics. Laughter was becoming more frequent and genuine. The break room, which had previously been a place for hurried coffee refills and awkward silence, was starting to feel like an actual gathering space. The catalyst for much of this change was Robert Kim, our IT manager. Robert was 45, soft-spoken, and had been with the company for nearly 8 years. He was the kind of person who fixed your computer problems efficiently and quietly, never drawing attention to himself. But apparently, he'd been paying attention to the subtle shifts happening around the office. On Friday afternoon, I was walking past the break room when I heard an unfamiliar sound. Robert laughing. Not the polite chuckle he usually offered when someone made a joke, but genuine, full-bodied laughter. I peered in to see him sitting with Elena and 2 other colleagues, animatedly describing something with his hands. "David," Elena called out, when she saw me. Perfect timing. Robert was just telling us about his weekend hobby. You're not going to believe this. Robert looked embarrassed but pleased. It's really not that interesting, he said, but his eyes were bright with enthusiasm. Are you kidding? Said Jennifer Walsh, our HR coordinator. Jennifer was in her early 30s, always professionally dressed, and had a reputation for being strictly by the book. But today she seemed more relaxed, her usual formal posture replaced by genuine curiosity. Robert builds elaborate model train setups, like entire miniature cities. He's got photos on his phone, and they're incredible. Robert pulled out his phone with obvious pride. I've been working on this landscape for about 3 years. It's a 1950s small town, complete with working streetlights and a functioning train system. He scrolled through photos of amazingly detailed miniature buildings, tiny people, and trains that looked museum quality. This is incredible, I said, genuinely amazed. Robert, this is art. His face flushed with pleasure. I never really thought of it that way. It's just something I do to relax. But lately, I've been thinking about maybe joining a model railroad club, or even entering some competitions. You absolutely should, Elena said. This level of craftsmanship deserves to be seen. Jennifer leaned forward. You know what? This is exactly what Margaret was talking about in her team meeting yesterday. She said something about how we all have hidden depths, and the company is stronger when people feel free to be their whole selves. I was surprised to hear this. Margaret hadn't mentioned giving any speeches about authenticity. She said that in a meeting? Not exactly a speech, Jennifer clarified. But she was talking about team dynamics and employee engagement, and she mentioned that she'd been thinking about how professional environments sometimes discourage people from sharing their full personalities. She said she thought we might be more creative and collaborative if we knew each other as complete human beings, instead of just job functions. This was news to me, and I made a mental note to ask Margaret about it later. But I was fascinated by how our personal transformation was apparently inspiring professional changes as well. Robert was still scrolling through his photos. Actually, I've been thinking about proposing a lunch and learn series where people could share their hobbies or interests. Not work-related stuff, just things that make us who we are outside of this building. That's a fantastic idea, Jennifer said. I could help you pitch it to management. I think they'd be receptive, especially with all the recent talk about employee engagement and workplace culture. Elena was practically bouncing with excitement. I would love that. I could talk about street art and urban photography. Jennifer, what would you present? Jennifer looked thoughtful. Well, I've been learning to make my own soap and skincare products. It started as a way to avoid harsh chemicals, but it's become this whole creative outlet. I never talk about it at work because it seems so different from HR stuff, but I actually love the chemistry and experimentation involved. See? Robert said. We all have these whole other lives that no one here knows about. It's like we're all part-time people at work. This comment resonated with everyone. We'd all been operating under the assumption that professionalism meant compartmentalization, that work selves and real selves had to be kept separate. But listening to Robert, Elena, and Jennifer share their passions, I realized how much more interesting and dynamic our workplace could be if people felt safe being authentic. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Marcus Thompson, one of the company's senior partners and the son of the firm's founder. Marcus was in his mid-40s, impeccably dressed, and had always struck me as someone who took the professional distance rule very seriously. He was polite, but formal with everyone, and I'd never seen him participate in casual office conversations. Sorry to interrupt, he said, but he didn't seem in a hurry to leave. I couldn't help overhearing something about model trains. Robert looked suddenly nervous, probably assuming he was about to be reprimanded for discussing non-work topics during office hours. Oh, yes, sir. We were taking our break and… Marcus held up a hand. No need to apologize. I was actually curious because my father was a model train enthusiast, had an entire basement set up when I was growing up. I haven't thought about those trains in years, but hearing you talk about it brought back some good memories. The break room went quiet. Everyone surprised by this personal revelation from someone we'd all assumed had no personal life outside of quarterly reports and client meetings. Really? Robert asked, his nervousness giving way to genuine interest. What scale did he work with? Cho scale, mostly. He had this incredible mountain range with working cable cars and a little mining operation. I used to spend hours down there with him, helping paint the tiny figures and buildings. Marcus's professional facade softened as he spoke, and for the first time I could see him as someone's son instead of just someone's boss. Elena, never one to let an opportunity for connection pass by, jumped in. Marcus, you should come see Robert's setup sometime. Or better yet, Robert should bring some photos to show at his Lunch and Learn presentation. Lunch and Learn presentation? Marcus looked intrigued. Jennifer, clearly sensing an opportunity to advance Robert's idea, explained the concept. Robert suggested a series where employees could share their hobbies and interests with colleagues. It could be a great team-building initiative and might help improve workplace culture. Marcus nodded slowly. That's actually not a bad idea. We've been getting feedback in our employee surveys about people feeling disconnected from their work and their colleagues. This might be exactly the kind of thing that could help address that. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Marcus sharing more memories of his father's hobby, and everyone else contributing ideas for potential presentations. By the time we all returned to our desks, Robert had unofficial approval to develop his Lunch and Learn proposal, and the break room dynamic had shifted permanently. Later that afternoon, I found Margaret in her office, updating project timelines on her computer. She looked up when I knocked, and her face brightened in a way that would have been impossible to imagine just a few weeks earlier. "How was your day?" she asked, and I could tell she genuinely wanted to know. I told her about the break room conversation, about Robert's model trains and Jennifer's soap making and Marcus's unexpected personal revelations. Margaret listened intently, occasionally asking questions or making comments that showed she was really processing what I was telling her. "This is exactly what I was hoping would happen," she said when I'd finished. "Not specifically, of course, But this idea that when a few people start being authentic, it gives everyone else permission to be authentic too. Jennifer mentioned you said something in a meeting about people bringing their whole selves to work. Margaret smiled. I've been thinking a lot about leadership lately, about the difference between managing people and actually connecting with them. I realized that I'd been so focused on maintaining professional boundaries that I'd forgotten. The whole point of those boundaries was supposed to be creating a safe, productive work environment. But what if the boundaries were actually making things less safe and less productive? She gestured toward the pottery mug on her desk, now joined by a small succulent and a framed photo of her and Jake hiking. When I started being more open about who I am outside of work, people started responding differently. Not less professionally, but more humanely. Does that make sense? Perfect sense, I said. I feel like I'm seeing everyone here for the first time. Like we've all been wearing masks for so long that we forgot we had faces underneath. Margaret laughed. That's exactly it. And the amazing thing is, removing the masks isn't making us less effective at our jobs. It's making us better. More creative, more collaborative, more invested in the work, because we're invested in each other. As I headed home that evening, I reflected on how much had changed in just a few weeks. The office felt more alive, more connected. People were having real conversations, sharing genuine interests, and supporting each other's growth in ways that went beyond professional development. But perhaps most importantly, I was starting to see that authenticity wasn't just an individual choice, it was a community practice. When Margaret and I had made our pact to be more genuine, we'd inadvertently created space for others to do the same. And as more people began bringing their real selves to work, that space kept expanding, creating a positive feedback loop of connection and creativity. I thought about the photo walk with Elena this weekend, about Robert's model trains, about Jennifer's soap-making experiments, about Marcus's childhood memories. We were all so much more interesting and complex than our job descriptions suggested, and for the first time since I'd started working at Thompson & Associates, I was excited to see what would happen next. The photo walk with Elena had been a revelation. We'd spent 4 hours wandering through Georgetown's industrial streets, capturing murals that exploded with color against weathered brick walls. Elena had an eye for composition that made me see familiar scenes in entirely new ways, while my technical knowledge of lighting helped her capture details she'd never noticed before. By the time we'd stopped for coffee at a local roastery, we were both energized in a way that felt foreign after months of corporate monotony. We should do this regularly, Elena had said, scrolling through the photos on my camera's display. Maybe we could even organize group photo walks with other people from the office. I bet there are others who'd love an excuse to explore the city. I'd agreed enthusiastically, but as Monday morning arrived, I found myself wondering if our weekend adventure had been too good to be true. The office felt smaller and grayer after spending hours in the vibrant outdoor world of street art and natural light. Still, I uploaded my favorite photos to my computer and set one as my desktop wallpaper, a shot of Elena laughing while pointing out a hidden mural tucked behind a food truck. Margaret noticed the change immediately when she stopped by my desk around 10 o'clock. Georgetown? She asked, recognizing the distinctive brick architecture in the background. Elena and I did a photo walk on Saturday. It was incredible. I clicked through a few more images, showing her the range of street art we'd discovered. These are really good, David, really good. Margaret leaned closer, studying the composition and lighting. You have a natural eye for this. Before I could respond, we were interrupted by the sharp click of heels on linoleum. Patricia Holloway, Thompson & Associates' other senior partner, approached my desk with the kind of purposeful stride that usually meant someone was in trouble. Patricia was everything Margaret wasn't: cold, calculating, and seemingly immune to any emotion that couldn't be quantified in a quarterly report. At 55, she'd built her career on the principle that business and personal life should never intersect, and she expected the same dedication from everyone around her. She'd been with the company for 12 years, and in all that time, I'd never heard her discuss anything that wasn't directly related to client deliverables or profit margins. Margaret, Patricia said, her voice carrying the kind of professional chill that could freeze coffee mid-sip. Could I speak with you in your office? And David, perhaps you could join us as well. The request felt more like a command, and I exchanged a quick glance with Margaret. Her expression had shifted back to the carefully neutral mask I remembered from our early working relationship. But I caught a flicker of something else. Not fear, exactly, but wariness. We followed Patricia to Margaret's office, where she closed the door with deliberate precision before turning to face us. Her gaze swept over Margaret's newly personalized space, taking in the pottery mug, the hiking photo, and the small succulent I'd noticed Margaret watering each morning. "I've been hearing some interesting reports about changes in office culture," Patricia began, settling into the chair across from Margaret's desk without waiting to be invited. "Apparently, we're now encouraging employees to spend work time discussing hobbies and personal interests." Margaret straightened in her chair. "I'm not sure what you mean, Patricia. Could you be more specific?" "Robert Kim has submitted a proposal for something called a Lunch and Learn series, where employees would present their personal hobbies to colleagues. He claims this has management support." Patricia's tone made it clear that she found the entire concept distasteful. Additionally, I've observed increased socialization in common areas, personal decorations appearing in workspaces, and what appears to be a general relaxation of professional standards. I felt my stomach tighten. The changes that had felt so positive and energizing suddenly seemed trivial and unprofessional under Patricia's scrutiny. I glanced at Margaret, who was maintaining eye contact with Patricia, but whose knuckles were white where she gripped her pen. "I think there may be some confusion," Margaret said carefully. "The Lunch and Learn proposal came from Robert's initiative to improve team cohesion and employee engagement. All activities would take place during designated break times and wouldn't interfere with productivity." Patricia's smile was razor-thin. "Employee engagement, I see. And whose idea was it to encourage this particular approach to engagement?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. I realized that Patricia wasn't just concerned about office policy. She was conducting an investigation. Someone had reported our changes in culture, and she was trying to identify the source. "The changes have evolved organically," Margaret replied. "Multiple employees have expressed interest in building stronger workplace relationships and finding more satisfaction in their daily work environment." "Organically." Patricia repeated the word as if it tasted bitter. "Margaret, you've been with this company for 6 years. In that time, you've maintained exemplary professional standards and delivered consistent results. I'd hate to see that record compromised by experimentation." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Patricia was warning Margaret that her newfound authenticity was being viewed as a liability rather than an asset. "With respect, Patricia," Margaret said, her voice gaining strength, "employee satisfaction surveys have consistently indicated that our staff feels disconnected from their work and colleagues. If we're serious about retention and productivity, we need to address those concerns. Our retention rates are perfectly acceptable. Our productivity metrics exceed industry standards." Patricia's response was crisp, factual, and completely dismissive of any human element in those statistics. "What we don't need is workplace drama disguised as team building." I felt compelled to speak up. "I'm sorry, but I don't understand how people getting to know each other better constitutes drama." Patricia turned her attention to me, and I immediately regretted opening my mouth. Her gaze was like being examined under a microscope by someone looking for flaws. "David, isn't it? You're relatively new here, so perhaps you don't understand our company culture. Thompson & Associates has built its reputation on professionalism, reliability, and results. Our clients trust us because they know we're focused on their needs, not distracted by personal entertainment." "But don't you think people work better when they feel connected to their colleagues?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I think people work better when they understand their roles and execute them efficiently," Patricia replied. "Connection, as you put it, is what we have company holiday parties for." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Patricia systematically dismantling every positive change we'd experienced over the past month. She questioned the appropriateness of personal items in workspaces, the productivity impact of extended break room conversations, and the professional image implications of employees discussing hobbies during office hours. By the time she left, promising to monitor the situation closely, both Margaret and I felt deflated. The energy and optimism that had been building throughout the office suddenly felt fragile and threatened. "I'm sorry," I said after Patricia's footsteps had faded down the hallway. "I shouldn't have argued with her." I probably made things worse. Margaret shook her head. You didn't make anything worse. You stood up for something you believed in. That's exactly what authenticity looks like, even when it's uncomfortable. But I could see the doubt creeping into her expression. The confidence she'd been building over the past weeks was being challenged by the very real possibility of professional consequences. What do you think she'll do? I asked. I don't know. Patricia has a lot of influence with the other partners. If she decides that our changes are disruptive to company culture. Margaret trailed off, but we both understood the implications. The rest of the week felt different. People were still friendly, still engaged with each other, but there was an underlying tension that hadn't existed before. Robert approached me on Tuesday to ask if I'd heard anything about his lunch and learn proposal being rejected. Elena mentioned that she'd been questioned by her supervisor about the amount of time she was spending in the break room. Even Marcus seemed more distant, as if he'd been reminded of the importance of maintaining professional boundaries. The most frustrating part was watching Margaret retreat into her old patterns. She began closing her office door more frequently, limiting her conversations to work-related topics, and removing some of the personal items she'd added to her space. The succulent remained, but the hiking photo disappeared, replaced by a generic motivational poster about teamwork. You don't have to do this, I told her on Thursday afternoon, finding her reorganizing her desk to look more traditionally professional. Yes, I do, she said without looking up. I have responsibilities here. People depend on me, and I can't jeopardize their jobs because I decided to have a midlife crisis. This isn't a midlife crisis. This is you becoming a better leader by becoming a more authentic person. Margaret finally looked at me, and I saw the internal struggle playing out in her expression. David, I have a mortgage. I have a son starting college next year. I have 15 years until retirement, and I can't afford to lose this job because I thought it would be fun to shake things up. I understood her position, but watching her abandon the progress she'd made felt like watching someone choose safety over happiness, fear over growth. And I was beginning to realize that the obstacles we faced weren't just professional, they were deeply personal. The breaking point came on Friday afternoon. I was working late, trying to finish a market analysis report, when I heard raised voices coming from the conference room. Through the glass walls, I could see Patricia, Margaret, and Marcus in what appeared to be a heated discussion. I couldn't hear specific words, but body language told the story. Patricia was leaning forward aggressively, pointing at documents spread across the table. Margaret was sitting rigidly, her arms crossed defensively. Marcus was rubbing his temples, looking like he wished he were anywhere else. The meeting lasted nearly an hour. When it finally ended, Margaret walked past my desk without making eye contact, gathered her things, and left the building. Patricia and Marcus remained in the conference room for another 20 minutes before Marcus emerged, looking exhausted and frustrated. I debated whether to reach out to Margaret over the weekend, but I didn't want to intrude on whatever personal processing she needed to do. Instead, I spent Saturday reviewing the photos from our Georgetown expedition, remembering how alive and energized we'd both felt just a week earlier. On Sunday, I received a text from Elena. Emergency coffee meeting. Something's happening with the Lunch and Learn program, and Robert is really upset. Can you meet us at Harbor Grounds at 2? I arrived to find Elena, Robert, and Jennifer huddled around a corner table, their expressions grim. Robert looked particularly distressed, his usual quiet demeanor replaced by visible agitation. They killed it, he said as soon as I sat down. The Lunch and Learn program. Patricia sent me an email yesterday saying that after careful consideration, management has decided that the program doesn't align with company priorities. What exactly did she say? I asked. Jennifer pulled out her phone and read from an email. While we appreciate employee initiative, Thompson & Associates maintains a commitment to professional excellence that requires clear boundaries between personal interests and workplace activities. We believe our current team-building initiatives adequately address employee engagement needs. That's corporate speak for sit down and shut up, Elena said bitterly. Robert looked defeated. I really thought this could make a difference. People were excited about it. Marcus seemed supportive. I don't understand what changed. I had a pretty good idea what had changed, but I wasn't sure how much to share about Margaret's situation, without betraying her confidence. There might be some internal politics involved, I said carefully. Politics, Jennifer repeated. Of course. God forbid we treat each other like human beings instead of productivity units. The conversation continued for another hour, with each of us sharing our frustration about the retreat back to the old, disconnected way of working. But underneath the disappointment, I sensed something else. A determination not to let the positive changes we'd experienced disappear entirely. So what do we do? Elena asked finally. Do we just accept that things go back to the way they were? No, I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. We don't accept it. We find other ways to stay connected, to support each other's growth, to remain authentic even in an environment that discourages authenticity. Robert looked skeptical. How do we do that without risking our jobs? It was a fair question, and I didn't have a complete answer. But I thought about Margaret's transformation, about the pottery mug that had started conversations, about the photo walk that had strengthened my friendship with Elena, about the brief glimpse of community we'd experienced before Patricia shut it down. We are more subtle, I said. We support each other individually instead of through official programs. We find ways to connect that don't threaten the system, but don't compromise who we are. Jennifer nodded slowly, like an underground authenticity movement. Exactly, Elena said, her eyes lighting up with the kind of mischievous energy I'd come to associate with her best ideas. We become authentic guerrillas. As we left the coffee shop, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. The obstacles were real. Patricia's opposition, Margaret's professional fears, the corporate culture that valued conformity over creativity. But the alternative was going back to the gray, disconnected existence we'd all been living before. Margaret had decided to stop pretending she didn't have feelings. Monday morning would bring new challenges, but it would also bring new opportunities to prove that authenticity wasn't just a luxury for people who could afford to take risks. It was a necessity for anyone who wanted to feel truly alive in their own life. Monday morning brought an email that changed everything. It arrived at 6:47 a.m. before most people had even started their commute, with the subject line, Organizational Restructuring, Immediate Review Required. The sender was Patricia Holloway, and the message was brief but devastating. All department heads report to Conference Room A at 8 a.m. sharp for emergency restructuring discussion. Individual performance reviews to follow. I stared at my phone screen in the elevator, reading the email 3 times before its implications fully sank in. This wasn't about the Lunch and Learn program anymore. This was Patricia making a power play, using the recent cultural changes as justification for a broader crackdown on what she perceived as declining professional standards. The office felt different when I arrived. People were clustered in small groups, speaking in hushed tones, their expressions ranging from confused to terrified. The usual morning energy was replaced by a tense anticipation that reminded me of the moments before a thunderstorm breaks. Elena intercepted me before I could reach my desk. "Did you see the email?" she asked, her voice tight with anxiety. "Just saw it. What do you think organizational restructuring means?" "Nothing good," she replied. Jennifer heard from someone in accounting that Patricia was here until almost midnight on Friday, and she had stacks of personnel files on her desk. Before I could respond, we were joined by Robert, who looked like he hadn't slept. "I think I'm in serious trouble," he said without preamble. "I got a call from HR on Saturday, asking me to prepare a detailed report on all my activities for the past month, including any unofficial initiatives or policy recommendations." The 3 of us stood there in silence, processing the implications. It was clear that Patricia wasn't just targeting the cultural changes we'd been celebrating. She was going after the people who had initiated them. "Where's Margaret?" Elena asked, looking toward the senior management offices. "Already in the conference room," Robert said. "I saw her go in about 20 minutes ago. She looked..." He paused, searching for the right word. "Resigned." The morning crawled by with excruciating slowness. Those of us not in leadership positions were left to speculate about what was happening behind the closed doors of Conference Room A. Occasionally, we'd see someone emerge, Marcus at one point, looking shell-shocked, and later Thomas Bradley, the head of our financial services department, who walked past us without making eye contact. Around 10:30, Margaret finally appeared. She walked directly to her office, closed the door, and didn't come out for the rest of the morning. Through her window, I could see her sitting at her desk, staring at her computer screen, but her posture suggested she wasn't actually working. At lunch, I knocked on her door. She looked up when I entered, and I was struck by how much older she seemed than she had just a week earlier. The vitality that had been growing in her expression over the past month was gone, replaced by a familiar professional weariness. "How bad is it?" I asked, settling into the chair across from her desk. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, as if she was trying to decide how much to tell me. "Patricia has been building a case," she said finally. "She's documented every change in office culture over the past month, every conversation about employee engagement, every instance of what she calls unprofessional boundary crossing." "What does that mean exactly?" "It means she's arguing that allowing personal relationships and interests to influence workplace dynamics has created a permissive environment that's detrimental to productivity and professional standards." Margaret's voice was flat, as if she was reciting someone else's words. "She's proposing a complete reset of office culture, with stricter policies about personal interactions and a renewed focus on what she calls results-driven professionalism." I felt a chill run through me. "And the other partners are going along with this?" "Marcus is trying to find a middle ground, but Thomas is fully on board with Patricia's approach. They're concerned about client perceptions and competitive positioning." Margaret rubbed her temples, looking exhausted. "And honestly, David, I can't entirely blame them. We're a business, not a social club." "But we're also human beings," I said, hearing the frustration in my own voice. "And human beings work better when they feel connected to each other and to their work." Margaret looked at me with something like pity. "That's a luxury we can't afford right now. Patricia made it very clear that anyone who can't adapt to a more traditional professional environment might not be a good fit for the company's future direction." The threat was unmistakable. I thought about my own position. Junior level, relatively new, easily replaceable. Then I thought about Elena's creative energy, Robert's quiet dedication, Jennifer's growing confidence. We were all vulnerable, and Patricia knew it. "So what happens now?" I asked. "Now we go back to the way things were before. We do our jobs, we maintain appropriate professional distance, and we stop trying to change a system that's worked successfully for decades." There was something in Margaret's tone that bothered me. A forced acceptance that didn't match the person I'd gotten to know over the past month. "Is that what you really want?" She looked at me sharply. "What I want is irrelevant. What matters is what I can afford, professionally and personally." "But what about everything you said about being tired of pretending you don't have feelings? What about pottery classes and Italian lessons and figuring out who you really are?" "That was naive," Margaret said. But I caught a flicker of something. In her eyes, regret maybe, or longing. "I'm 51 years old, David. I can't afford to have a quarter-life crisis at this stage of my career." I wanted to argue with her, to remind her of how alive she'd seemed when she first started being honest about her feelings. But I could see the fear underneath her resignation, and I understood it. She was trying to protect not just her job, but her son's future, her financial security, her ability to maintain the life she'd built. That afternoon, Patricia called individual meetings with several employees, including Elena, Robert, and me. When my turn came at 3:30, I entered the conference room to find Patricia sitting alone at the head of the long table, a manila folder open in front of her. "David, please sit down," she said, gesturing to the chair directly across from her. "I wanted to discuss your role here at Thompson & Associates and ensure we're aligned on expectations moving forward." I sat down, trying to project confidence, despite the anxiety churning in my stomach. "Of course." Patricia opened the folder and pulled out several printed pages. "I've been reviewing your work performance over the past 3 years, and overall, your technical skills and project deliverables have been satisfactory. However, I have some concerns about your recent behavior and its potential impact on workplace dynamics." She slid one of the pages across the table to me. It was a timeline of my activities over the past month. Coffee meetings with Margaret, photo walks with Elena, break room conversations with various colleagues. The level of detail was unsettling, suggesting that someone had been monitoring and reporting on our interactions. "I'm not sure I understand the concern," I said, keeping my voice steady. These are all activities that took place during breaks or outside of work hours. The concern, David, is that your increased social engagement with colleagues, particularly senior staff, suggests a misunderstanding of appropriate professional boundaries. Additionally, your advocacy for informal workplace initiatives indicates a lack of respect for established company policies and procedures. The clinical language couldn't disguise what was essentially an accusation of insubordination. I thought about Margaret's advice to be careful, to not rock the boat, to prioritize job security over personal authenticity. The safe response would be to apologize, to promise to refocus on my assigned duties, to retreat back into the anonymous professionalism I'd maintained for 3 years. Instead, I found myself saying, I don't think building relationships with colleagues or supporting initiatives that improve workplace culture constitutes insubordination. Patricia's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in her eyes. I see. So you believe your judgment about what constitutes appropriate workplace culture is superior to the management team's judgment? It was a trap, and I recognized it. Any response that defended my position would be seen as insubordinate, while backing down would be seen as admission of wrongdoing. I believe that employees work better when they feel valued as complete human beings, not just as job functions. Complete human beings, Patricia repeated, as if the phrase amused her. Tell me, David, do you think our clients hire us because they want to work with complete human beings, or because they want results? I think they get better results when they work with people who are engaged and passionate about their work. Patricia closed the folder with a sharp snap. Passion is fine, David, as long as it's passion for excellence in your assigned responsibilities. What concerns me is passion for social experimentation that distracts from those responsibilities. The meeting continued for another 15 minutes, with Patricia systematically dismantling every positive change we'd experienced over the past month. She questioned the appropriateness of my photography discussions, my friendship with Elena, my supportive relationship with Margaret. By the time I left the conference room, I felt like I'd been through a psychological audit designed to identify and eliminate any trace of authentic human connection. Elena was waiting for me in the hallway. When I emerged, her face pale with anger. How did it go? She asked. About as well as expected, I said. You? She basically told me that my creative enthusiasm was incompatible with professional graphic design standards, and that I needed to focus on conventional approaches that wouldn't challenge client expectations. Elena's voice was shaking with frustration. She actually said that innovation was fine as long as it didn't involve taking risks. We were joined by Robert, who looked devastated. She's recommending that I be transferred to a different department, he said quietly. Apparently, my tendency toward unauthorized initiatives makes me unsuitable for a management track position. The three of us stood there in the hallway, processing the systematic destruction of everything we'd been building. It felt like watching a garden being bulldozed. All the growth, all the potential, all the beauty we'd been cultivating reduced to rubble in the name of efficiency and control. This is insane, Elena said. We're being punished for treating each other like human beings. We're being punished for challenging a system that benefits from treating people like machines, I corrected. Patricia's not evil. She's just protecting a way of doing business that's worked for her for decades. So what do we do? Robert asked. Do we just accept this? Before I could answer, Margaret appeared at the end of the hallway. She walked toward us with purpose, her expression more determined than I'd seen it all day. When she reached us, she looked at each of us in turn, as if she was making some kind of internal calculation. I need to talk to all of you, she said. Not here. Can you meet me at Harbor Grounds after work? 5:30? We all nodded, recognizing something important in her tone. As she walked away, Elena whispered, What do you think that was about? I think, I said, watching Margaret's retreating figure. It was about someone deciding they've had enough of being afraid. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of tension and anticipation. The office felt like a pressure cooker, with everyone walking on eggshells and speaking in whispers. But underneath the fear, I sensed something else, a quiet rebellion brewing among the people who had tasted authenticity and weren't willing to give it up entirely. At 5:30 sharp, I arrived at Harbor Grounds to find Margaret already, seated at our usual corner table. She'd changed out of her business suit into jeans and a casual sweater, and her hair was loose around her shoulders instead of pulled back in its usual professional style. She looked like the person I'd first met in her office that evening a month ago. Real, vulnerable, and ready to tell the truth. Elena and Robert arrived within minutes of each other, and we all settled around the table with a sense of anticipation. Margaret looked at each of us seriously before speaking. "I've been thinking all afternoon about what Patricia said in our meeting," she began. "About appropriate professional boundaries and results-driven professionalism and the need to maintain traditional workplace culture. And I realized something important." She paused, as if gathering her courage. "I realized that everything she said was designed to make me afraid. Afraid of losing my job. Afraid of jeopardizing my financial security. Afraid of being seen as unprofessional or inappropriate. And for most of the day, it worked. I was terrified." "But?" Elena prompted. Margaret smiled, and it was the first genuine smile I'd seen from her all day. "But then I remembered what I told David that first night. I said I was 51 and tired of pretending I don't have feelings, and I realized that retreating back into professional pretense isn't protecting my future. It's sacrificing it." She looked around the table at each of us. "Patricia is offering us a choice between safety and authenticity. She's betting that we'll choose safety, that we'll be too afraid of the consequences to stand up for what we believe in." "And what do you think we should do?" Robert asked quietly. Margaret's expression became fierce, more determined than I'd ever seen it. "I think we should prove her wrong." Margaret's declaration that we should prove Patricia wrong hung in the air like a battle cry. The coffee shop buzzed with its usual evening energy around us, but our corner table felt like a war room where we were planning something that could either save our careers or destroy them. "What exactly are you proposing?" Robert asked, his voice careful but hopeful. Margaret leaned forward, her eyes bright with the kind of intensity I'd seen when she first started talking about pottery classes and Italian lessons. "I'm proposing that we stop playing by rules that were designed to diminish us. Patricia wants us to believe that authenticity and professionalism are mutually exclusive. But what if she's wrong? What if the most professional thing we can do is be genuinely ourselves?" Elena was nodding enthusiastically. "You're talking about calling her bluff. I'm talking about something bigger than that," Margaret said. "I'm talking about demonstrating that authentic leadership and genuine human connection actually produce better results than fear-based management and artificial professional distance." She pulled out her phone and showed us a document she'd been working on. "I spent the afternoon researching companies that have successfully implemented authentic workplace cultures. Patagonia, Google, Southwest Airlines, organizations where people are encouraged to bring their whole selves to work, where vulnerability is seen as a leadership strength, where creativity and innovation flourish because people feel safe to take risks. Those are massive corporations with different dynamics than a mid-sized consulting firm," Robert pointed out, though he didn't sound dismissive. "True," Margaret acknowledged, "but the principles are the same. People perform better when they feel valued, trusted, and connected to their colleagues, when they feel like their contributions matter beyond just completing assigned tasks." I thought about the changes we'd all experienced over the past month, the increased creativity, the collaborative energy, the sense of purpose that had begun to emerge when people started connecting with each other authentically. "So how do we prove that to Patricia and the other partners?" Margaret's smile was strategic. "We show them measurable results, real data that demonstrates the connection between authentic workplace culture and business outcomes." Over the next hour, she outlined her plan. Instead of retreating into professional conformity, we would document and quantify the positive changes that had occurred during our month of increased authenticity. Employee engagement, project creativity, collaboration effectiveness, client satisfaction. All metrics that Patricia and the partners couldn't dismiss as social experimentation. "I've already started gathering data," Margaret said, showing us spreadsheets on her phone. "Remember the Morrison account that Elena redesigned last week? The client feedback was the most positive we've received in 6 months. The team collaboration on the Henderson project improved efficiency by 30% compared to similar projects. Even small things like break room conversations have led to cross-departmental problem-solving that saved us time and resources." Elena's eyes were shining. You're building a business case for authenticity. Exactly. And I'm not just talking about proving Patricia wrong. I'm talking about proving to the entire company that treating people like complete human beings isn't just morally right, it's financially smart. Robert looked skeptical, but intrigued. And if the data doesn't support our position? If Patricia's approach actually produces better short-term results? Margaret was quiet for a moment, considering this. Then we'll have learned something important about the kind of workplace we want to be part of. But I don't think that's what we'll find. I think we'll discover that authenticity isn't a luxury. It's a competitive advantage. We spent another hour refining the plan. Margaret would present our findings to the partnership at their monthly review meeting, which was scheduled for the following Friday. Elena would compile visual presentations showing the creative improvements in her design work. Robert would analyze productivity and efficiency metrics. I would document the informal collaboration and knowledge sharing that had emerged from our improved relationships. As we prepared to leave, Margaret looked at each of us seriously. I want you to understand what we're risking here. If this doesn't work, if the partners decide that our approach is disruptive or unprofessional, we could all face serious career consequences. We're already facing those consequences, Elena pointed out. Patricia made it clear that the status quo isn't an option for people like us. Then we might as well go down fighting for something we believe in, Robert added, and I was struck by the quiet determination in his voice. The next week was unlike anything I'd ever experienced in a professional environment. Instead of the usual individual focus on personal deliverables, we found ourselves working as a genuine team, each contributing our strengths to build something larger than any of us could have created alone. Margaret coordinated our efforts with the strategic thinking that had made her a successful project manager, but now applied to something she was personally passionate about. Elena brought her creative vision to presenting our data in ways that were both visually compelling and emotionally resonant. Robert applied his analytical skills to identifying patterns and correlations that none of us had noticed individually. My role became documenting the human stories behind the numbers. The moments of genuine connection that had led to breakthrough solutions, the conversations that had sparked innovative approaches, the collaborative energy that had made difficult projects feel engaging rather than burdensome. As we worked, I noticed something remarkable happening. Other people in the office began gravitating toward our energy. Jennifer started contributing insights about employee morale and retention. Marcus began sharing his own observations about team dynamics and client relationships. Even Thomas, who had initially supported Patricia's traditional approach, seemed curious about our findings. The office atmosphere was tense but electric. Word had spread about Margaret's upcoming presentation, and people were choosing sides, some retreating into safe conformity, others quietly expressing support for our more authentic approach. Patricia, meanwhile, seemed to be watching everything, with the calculated patience of someone who believed she held all the winning cards. She maintained her professional courtesy, but with an underlying coldness that made it clear she viewed our efforts as confirmation of her concerns about workplace disruption. Friday morning arrived with the weight of months of transformation distilled into a single presentation that would determine not just our individual futures, but the direction of workplace culture at Thompson & Associates. The partnership conference room had never felt smaller. Margaret sat at one end of the long table, her laptop connected to the wall-mounted screen, while Patricia, Marcus, and Thomas arranged themselves with the formal distance of judges preparing to render a verdict. Elena, Robert, and I had been invited to observe, though our presence felt more like that of defendants awaiting sentencing. Margaret began with a simple statement that cut through the corporate formality like a clear bell. 6 weeks ago, I told David that I was 51 and tired of pretending I don't have feelings. Today, I want to show you what happened when a few people in this office stopped pretending and started being authentic. The presentation that followed was unlike anything I'd seen in a business context. Margaret didn't just show charts and graphs, she told stories. She shared Robert's model train passion and how it had led to a breakthrough solution on a logistics project for a manufacturing client. She described Elena's street art knowledge and how it had inspired an innovative marketing campaign that exceeded client expectations by 40%. Authenticity isn't just about personal fulfillment, Margaret explained, clicking through slides that showed measurable improvements in creativity, collaboration, and client satisfaction. It's about accessing the full range of human intelligence and capability that we leave untapped when we force people into narrow professional roles. She showed data on employee engagement scores, which had increased dramatically during our month of authentic workplace culture. She presented client feedback that specifically praised the innovative thinking and collaborative energy they'd experienced from our team. She demonstrated how informal knowledge sharing had led to efficiency improvements and cost savings. But the most powerful moment came when she addressed Patricia's concerns directly. "Patricia, you've argued that personal relationships and authentic self-expression create unprofessional boundaries and workplace drama. I want to show you what actually happened when people felt safe to be genuinely themselves." The screen displayed a timeline of conflict resolution, showing how the few interpersonal issues that had arisen during our authentic period were resolved more quickly and effectively than similar conflicts in previous months. Employee retention had improved. Sick days had decreased. Even workplace accidents had declined. "People who feel valued and connected don't create drama," Margaret said. "They solve problems. They support each other. They invest their full energy in collective success, rather than protecting themselves from a hostile environment." Patricia listened with her characteristic poker face, but I caught Marcus and Thomas exchanging glances that suggested they were genuinely surprised by the data. Margaret's conclusion was both professional and deeply personal. "I'm not advocating for chaos or the elimination of professional standards. I'm advocating for the recognition that our professional standards should enhance human potential rather than suppress it. We're not asking for the right to be unprofessional. We're asking for the right to be professionally authentic." The room was silent for a long moment after Margaret finished. Then Thomas spoke first, his voice thoughtful rather than critical. "These are impressive results, Margaret. But how do we know they're sustainable? How do we know this isn't just a temporary boost from novelty?" "That's a fair question," Margaret replied. "And the honest answer is that we don't know yet. But we do know that the traditional approach was producing declining engagement and increasing turnover. We have evidence that a more authentic approach produces better results, at least in the short term. Isn't that worth exploring further?" Patricia finally spoke, her tone measured but lacking its usual coldness. "I'll admit that the data is more compelling than I expected, but I remain concerned about the potential for unpredictability. How do we maintain quality control and professional standards while encouraging this level of personal expression?" It was Elena who answered, her voice steady and confident. "By trusting people to be their best selves, rather than assuming they need to be controlled into acceptable behavior. The same intelligence and creativity that makes someone excellent at their job doesn't disappear when they're allowed to be authentic. It gets stronger." The discussion continued for another hour, with questions, challenges, and gradually emerging acknowledgement that our experiment had produced results that couldn't be dismissed. Marcus seemed genuinely intrigued by the possibilities. Thomas remained cautious, but appeared willing to consider a pilot program. Even Patricia, while maintaining her reservations, acknowledged that the business outcomes were impressive. The final decision was to implement a 6-month trial period of what Margaret termed authentic professionalism, maintaining high standards and client focus while creating space for genuine human connection and individual expression. Robert's Lunch and Learn program was reinstated. Personal items and workspaces were explicitly approved. Cross-departmental collaboration was actively encouraged. As we left the conference room, I felt a profound shift in the office atmosphere. People who had been walking on eggshells for weeks suddenly seemed to stand taller, speak more freely, engage more openly with their colleagues. Margaret found me at my desk later that afternoon, her expression reflecting the same mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration I was feeling. "We did it," she said simply. "You did it," I corrected. "That presentation was incredible." She shook her head. "We all did it. This only worked because people were willing to be vulnerable, to take risks, to support each other even when the outcome was uncertain." Over the following weeks, the changes continued to ripple through Thompson & Associates. The Lunch and Learn program launched with Robert's presentation on model railroading, followed by Jennifer's demonstration of artisanal soap making, and Elena's photo tour of Seattle street art. Marcus surprised everyone by presenting his collection of vintage jazz records and sharing stories about the musicians who had influenced his approach to leadership. My own presentation featured the photography, I'd been doing around the city, but more importantly, it showcased pictures of my colleagues engaged in their passions. Margaret covered in clay at pottery class, Robert explaining his intricate train layouts, Elena pointing out hidden murals in Georgetown. The photos told the story of people coming alive when they felt free to be themselves. Client reactions exceeded our expectations. Rather than seeing our authenticity as unprofessional, they began commenting on the energy and creativity of our team. Several specifically requested to work with us again, citing the collaborative and innovative approach we brought to their projects. But perhaps the most significant change was in Margaret herself. 6 months after she'd first admitted to being tired of pretending she didn't have feelings, she had become a different kind of leader. One who inspired rather than managed, who created space for others to grow rather than simply directing their work. "You know what I realized?" she told me one evening as we were both preparing to leave the office. At a reasonable hour, having learned to respect our own boundaries as much as our work commitments. Being authentic isn't just about expressing your feelings or pursuing your hobbies. It's about having the courage to be fully present in your own life. I looked around the office, now decorated with personal touches that reflected the real people who worked there. Elena's street art photography hung next to Robert's model train blueprints. Jennifer's handmade soaps sat in the break room next to Margaret's pottery mugs. My own photographs of Seattle's changing seasons cycled through a digital frame on the reception desk. "It looks like a place where people want to be," I said. "It looks like a place where people can be themselves," Margaret corrected, "and that makes all the difference." As I walked to my car that evening, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this point. It had started with one person being brave enough to admit she was tired of pretending. And it had grown into a workplace transformation that proved authenticity wasn't just personally fulfilling, it was professionally powerful. My camera sat on the passenger seat, no longer hidden in my desk drawer but openly part of who I was at work and everywhere else. This weekend, Elena and I were planning another photo walk, this time joined by Robert and Jennifer. Marcus had expressed interest in coming along, curious to see the city through the eyes of people who noticed beauty in unexpected places. Margaret had signed up for an advanced pottery class and was planning her trip to Italy, finally ready to experience Rome as the person she'd always wanted to be, rather than just another business traveler rushing between meetings. The authenticity pact we'd made over coffee that morning months ago had evolved into something none of us could have imagined, not just personal transformation but professional revolution. We'd proven that the choice between success and authenticity was a false one, that the most successful thing any of us could do was have the courage to be genuinely, completely, unapologetically ourselves. And it had all started with someone being brave enough to say, "I'm 51 and tired of pretending I don't have feelings." Sometimes the most radical thing you can do is simply tell the truth about who you are and what you need. Sometimes that truth changes everything, not just for you, but for everyone around you who's been waiting for permission to be real. Life doesn't begin at any particular age. It begins the moment you decide to stop performing and start living. And when you make that decision, you discover that authenticity isn't just a personal choice. It's a gift you give to everyone whose life you touch. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.